So as you're returning and getting into your seats, this is going to be another fantastic panel, and I'm honored to introduce it. You know, Mike Gold does a lot of things, and when he's not helping us write the rules about the Artemis Accords, which is this next panel discussion, an international campaign to the moon and Mars, what you might not know about Mike is that he was the first pitcher in Russian Siberian baseball. How about that? We have a fantastic international panel for you. Let's welcome, please, Mike Gold of Redwire.
All right, who's ready to talk some space policy, huh? Space policy, here we go. All right, we've got a blockbuster panel for you here today. Let me begin by introducing Valda Vikmanis-Keller, who is the Director of the Office of Space Affairs, Bureau of Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Really long title because they do a lot of work. Previously, Valda serves as the Chief of Staff in the Department of Bureau's Budget and Planning, as Division Director of the Technical Advisory Division of the Knowledge and Management Office, where she provided technical expertise through a network of in-house and external subject matter experts. Let's have a round of applause for Valda. Huh? Who do we have behind the curtain next? Who knows? How about Gabriel Swiney, everyone? Gabriel, my partner in crime with the Artemis Accords. Gabriel is Senior Policy Advisor at NASA, where he works in the Office of Technology, Policy, and Strategy. He's the author of a recent study on policy issues related to lunar exploration and other policy issues related to NASA's Moon to Mars objectives. Gabriel advises senior leaders at NASA and the White House. It was my pleasure to work with him while I was at NASA. This is the man who came up with the idea for the first lunar regolith purchase by the agency. So always creative. Let's have a round of applause for Gabriel. Next up, we have Masami Onoda, everyone. Masami, our terrific representative of JAXA here in Washington, D.C., where she represents Japanese Space Agency in America. Extensive experience in international affairs, space policy, satellite applications, industry relations. She has had several international positions, including the Intergovernmental Group on Earth Observation, Secretariat in Geneva, Switzerland, the United Office for Outer Space Affairs, and USA in Vienna, and has worked with SMEs on small satellite technology transfer while operating the JAXA office in Osaka. Someone else who worked with us closely in the Artemis Accords would not exist without Masami. Let's have another round of applause for Masami Onoda. And last, but certainly not least, let's bring him on out, our actual test pilot, our top gun of this panel, Colonel Aniello Violetti, who's the space attaché at the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C., where he previously served as former Director of Support Unit for Space and Aerospace Policies of the Office of Military Advisor to the Presidency of the Council of Ministers and Deputy Head of General Office for Space. He commanded the 311th Flight Group of the Experimental Flight Department, was a test pilot and fighter pilot for the Tornado ECR aircraft, and has accumulated more than 3,500 hours of military flight and about 900 hours of civilian flight. Let's have a round of applause for him and his service and for joining us today. Thank you. Just realizing I may have to stand this entire time. They're getting their money's worth out of me. So, look, we are here to talk about the Artemis Accords, and we are going to begin with a quick description of what the Accords are. And I've got 8 minutes, so everyone strap in for the fastest description of the Artemis Accords you've probably ever received. You can't talk about the Artemis Accords, though, without starting with the Artemis program. Who's aware of the Artemis program? International effort? That is a good audience for that. And look, even our panelists. Let's go back to the moon and, importantly, on to Mars. That it's very important that no one forget that the purpose of the Artemis Accords is not just lunar. Lunar is the first step to ultimately get to Mars. And if I could... Thank you, Mars partisans. It's all of both. We're a uniter. And if I could say just one word about summarizing the Accords, it's diversity. Artemis was named after... Who is Artemis? Anyone? Sister of Apollo. Thank you. So to make the point of the first woman, the first person of color on the moon, but also diversity of organizations, that the private sector is playing a much larger role, certainly, than ever before, certainly much more than the Apollo program, and then diversity of nations. That here on this panel you see representatives, and the Artemis program is designed to be the broadest, most diverse human spaceflight program in history. And that's what the Accords are. One, for countries to explicitly join this program, largest, most diverse ever. And second, to commit to norms of behavior to create a peaceful and prosperous future for all of us in space. And now I will very quickly take you through those norms. The first, peaceful purposes. That as we go to space, we want to build a better future for humanity, and it begins with a commitment to peace. So any nation that signs the Accords commits to only conducting peaceful activities as part of the Artemis program. Transparency. So much conflict caused by miscommunication, misperceptions. Therefore, transparency is the very spine of the Artemis Accords, that the best way we can avoid conflict is to be transparent relative to plans, proposals, activities, which is why any nation that signs the Accords is committing to be transparent relative to their space activities, and this is a value that you will see time and again in the Accords. Interoperability. So much of the Accords is about implementing the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts. And while you won't find interoperability in those documents, it's very much in the spirit of those treaties, because if we're going to have global space development, if we're going to have an environment that is conducive to private sector development, we must be interoperable. It is critical not only for people to be able to talk to each other, but for their machines, their spacecraft, their computers. I'll age myself, everyone remembers Betamax and VHS, right? Blu-ray, DVD. We need systems that can talk to each other, and that's going to be very true in space. So any country that signs the Accords is committing to at least striving for interoperable systems, and a reason for that is emergency assistance. That you're always going to be more successful in rendering emergency assistance if a system is more interoperable. And any country that signs the Accords is committing to rescue astronauts. We think this is foundational for any civil space program. By the way, this includes astronauts who may not be signatories to the Artemis Accords, but if there's an astronaut in need, if you're part of the Artemis program, rescue options will be conducted per the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts. Registration of space objects, absolutely fundamental to everything that we want to accomplish to create a peaceful and prosperous future. If you don't register, then we can't avoid conflict. We can't tackle issues like liability. Everything is built on proper registration, which is why countries that sign the Accords are committing to supporting registration per the requirements of the Registration Convention, and if they aren't a signatory to the Registration Convention, they will commit to becoming one. Release of scientific data. While we'd like to take everyone to the moon and to Mars, unfortunately not everyone will be able to go, but we virtually bring the world on this amazing journey of discovery through the full, open, free, and timely release of scientific data. So fundamental to this journey of exploration and creating benefits around the world that if you have an internet connection, you can join the Artemis mission because all of this information will be released publicly. Protecting heritage, very simple, just like we do here on Earth, that we honor our history in museums and artifacts. We commit to doing the same when we go to the moon and go to Mars, that we will respect our heritage, preserve it, whether that's human spaceflight, such as this picture, or systems that have value and need to be memorialized as part of history. Space resources. It's extraordinarily important, and particularly for Martian exploration, that we learn to live off the land. If we can't leverage in situ resources, we will fail as a society, as a species, to be able to explore and eventually colonize and stay on Mars and the moon as well, which is why it's so important part of the Accords where countries commit to safely and respectfully utilizing resources. You can extract, you can utilize, but doing so in full compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. To be clear, what the Accords don't do is create any stay-out zones or exclusionary zones. We will talk about that in a moment relative to deconfliction of activities. So much of the Artemis Accords is about implementing the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, and other international obligations. And in the Outer Space Treaty, one of the most important aspects is preventing harmful interference. And the way the Accords do that is creating safety zones, which are exactly what the name indicates. It's the area with which a country may cause harmful interference. And within that zone, a country has an obligation to report their activities, again, transparency, publicly to the United Nations, and to coordinate, to communicate with any other country entering that area so that you can avoid conflict and uphold the Outer Space Treaty's requirement to avoid harmful interference. What this is not is a stay-out zone or an exclusionary zone. This is actually designed to ensure that multiple parties can operate in the same area. And finally, again, we want to do better in the future than we have in the past, and we certainly have not handled debris particularly well here on Earth. Let's do better in space. So for any country that signs the Artemis Accords, they're committing to at least have a plan for the efficient passivation and disposal of debris so that we can prevent the same debris issues from occurring on the Moon, Mars, and beyond than what is occurring here on Earth today. And this is wonderful that we were unable to update this chart in time for the new Czech Republic joining the Artemis Accords. Round of applause for the Czech Republic joining the Accords. I like when things move so quickly, we can't even have the updated chart. So the Czech Republic, oh, is it up there? Jeez. You know what? I apologize to my comms team. They are on the ball adding that when I didn't even ask. So it's great to have number 24, and we'll talk more about additional entrants soon. I don't even know if this video will play. What would be a space presentation without a rocket launch? This is the launch of Artemis 1 in November of last year, the manifestation physically of the Artemis program, and the reason that we have the Accords. You can also see that there's a very frightened bird that flies by and is wondering why it's daytime on this night. We were out at a patio at Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex. And this is about the moment where the patio started shaking so much I went inside. I was afraid the building couldn't take it. Here we have some images taken from the Artemis 1 mission by actually Redwire cameras. So we're very proud to be part of the mission there at Redwire. And I always end with, the reason we support the Accords is we want a future that is more Star Trek and less Star Wars. So with that, now that we've gone through a little bit what the principles of the Accords are, I'd like to open and discuss a little bit what the future of the Accords may be. So, Valda, if you don't mind, if we could turn to you. And as we mentioned, the Czech Republic recently signed the Accords, and just wondering what you see the future expansion of the Accords looking like relative to the countries that can sign and the substance in terms of policy dialogue that this will help us move forward on.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you as well to the H2M organizers, and I'm happy to be here with Nello, Masami, and Gabriel, all excellent colleagues. As Mike said, Czech Republic just signed, I think about 2 weeks ago, making them the 24th signatory. The Artemis Accords were established in October 2020, so in a relatively short period of time, we've managed to bring 24 nations on board. I think it's important to note that most recently, on the margins of the Africa Leaders Summit in December, we signed on our first 2 African nations, Rwanda and Nigeria. And in terms of what the Accords hold in store, I think we have been very cognizant of the fact that, we have been increasing the number of signatories moving forward, which is terrific and important, and we need to diversify those signatories geographically, according to space capabilities. But there is a recognition that it can't simply be a list of signatories. It needs to be something more than that. So as part of that effort, at the International Astronautical Congress in Paris last year, we convened the first ever, along with NASA. I should point out that this is a joint NASA State Department endeavor. We convened the first ever in-person meeting of the signatories. At that point, we were at 21. 19 of those were present at the meeting in Paris, and they were heads of space agencies or members of foreign ministries. And we had a 90-minute conversation about wither the Artemis Accords. What does this mean? What do we do with them? And I have to say, I was there, and I was very nervous when you do one of these things, that when we opened it for questions, that it would be sort of like, dead air. Incredibly robust conversation. And what grew out of that, and I'm sure Gabriel will talk a bit more about it, was 2 working groups. One focused on deconfliction of lunar activities, and the second focused on, I guess we call it the value proposition of the Artemis Accords. How do you encourage other nations, whether they are spacefaring nations or not, how do you get them to realize the importance and the significance of the Accords and joining the Accords? And so those working groups are meeting periodically, and they will report out at the second ever in-person meeting of the Accord signatories, which will take place at the next IAC being held in Baku. So I would just add that in addition to that, I know that our NASA colleagues, certainly the State Department colleagues, we take the opportunity to engage, whether it's bilaterally or multilaterally in the UN, to talk about the Accords, talk about their importance. The Accords aren't meant to supplant or do an end run around UN agencies. The Accords are a way for us to amplify the important message of cooperation, of sustainability, of responsible use of space. And so I think there is a growing momentum, a recognition of importance, and I think the future for Artemis is very bright.
Wonderful. Thank you, Valda. And as we talk about the partnership that you mentioned between state and NASA, Gabriel's our ringer because he was state and is now NASA, so bridging the 2 worlds. And Gabriel, while he was state, it was part of the partnership, and it was a pleasure to work with him on the Accords. Gabriel issued and wrote so much of the text of the Accords. So I'm wondering, as an author there, Gabriel, what you think has been achieved through the Accords. Has it done what you and the other authors set out to do? What has the impact been generally on the space policy dialogue from the Accords?
Yeah, I'm reminded, and thanks, Mike, for the question. Thanks for organizing this, as also to the organizers of the conference as well. I'm reminded of why we came up with this idea, this crazy idea in the first place. And it was out of conversations we'd had with our partners. You see all the flags up there. And I think one fundamental thing to remember is that the Artemis program and NASA's broader Moon to Mars campaign is far and away the most collaborative, diverse, global, scientific initiative that has ever occurred. Right? That sounds like hyperbole, but it's true. It's not only the largest exploration program in terms of money and ambition, but it is also the most cooperative that humanity has ever undertaken. So we were spending a lot of time traveling around the world, negotiating with partners, talking about some very specific things, like in particular the Gateway Station, right? The small space station that's going to orbit the moon. And we had to figure out a lot of what you might think of as like management kind of problems. Who's going to build what, and how are you going to govern it, and who's going to pay for different things? And that's all super important, but it still didn't answer a lot of these fundamental questions, like about how you behave when you actually get to the moon or then move on to Mars. And in those conversations with our partners, we recognized that we didn't have answers to those problems. That I was a lawyer for the State Department at the time, and from a lawyer's perspective, it's a really awkward position to be in, to not be able to give your clients, to be able to give the operators legal guidance or guidance in terms of policy, right? They're going to the moon, they plan to go to Mars, but you can't tell them how to implement the Outer Space Treaty or how to avoid interference with other actors. So that's the setup to answering your question. I think, your question of what has the space community achieved, we finally started to answer those questions, right? We've taken the very general text of the Outer Space Treaty and we've taken it a couple steps further. Not that we've supplanted it or changed it or anything like that. We've fleshed it out and we've said, what would it mean to actually implement the Outer Space Treaty in the context that we're actually going to be faced, right? On the moon or on Mars. And so now we have 24 countries who all share a common vision of what that looks like. And that is, I think, sometimes a little bit of a shocking achievement. And now, as Valda said, we're taking that to the next level of really digging down into operations. So I think that's going to be where, the ultimate result will be is designing missions around these principles, not only to achieve scientific and technical goals, which obviously drive what we do in terms of our exploration, but to build in these principles and how we want to behave into the actual mission design. And that's where, like, the deconfliction working group that the Artemis Accord signatories put together, that I have the honor of chairing, and the other working groups, and then all the conversations we have at the United Nations, that's where that comes in, right? Where we will get together in a room, whether virtual or in person, and say, this is the actual mission we plan to do. Here's the date, here's the target, here's the instruments, here's the hardware. Are you going to be nearby? Are you involved? What can we do to avoid interference, implement the Artemis Accords? All that kind of nuts and bolts stuff where you take the law and you take the policy and you translate it into engineering and mission design. That is a conversation that before 2020, the space community did not know how to have. And it's really hard still. There's lots of details to be worked out. Everything's an issue of first impression, so it's a lot of, it's a lot of learning as we go. But you couldn't even have that conversation a couple years ago. And now we can. So I think that's real progress.
Terrific. How many people here have read the Artemis Accords? More people should. It's a real page turner. And if you thought the English was good in the Accords and it was well written, it's largely because of our friends in Japan, who I am convinced speak better English than we do, and we know now play better baseball than we do as the World Baseball Classic Championship in Japan. So our friends in Japan. So with that, Masami, I'd love to turn to you and to hear a little bit about how Japan and JAXA views the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords, and particularly relative to their impact on Mars, how you see these norms of behavior being important for Martian exploration.
Questions are getting creative now, but I'll do my best to answer. And first of all, thank you for having me here again. I remember I was here in 2019, pre-COVID, pre-Artemis Accords, and it's hard to believe there was a world before Artemis Accords now. So back then, I was here speaking on policy with Ryan Whitley, who was at the National Space Council at that time. I said, because, Japanese love to be planful, hate surprises, and that was the former administration. And somebody afterwards came to me and said, what an elegant way to say can you not decide even whether to go to Mars or to the moon, whether to use Gateway, not use Gateway, and all of those were in mid-air and affected by tweets even. And that wasn't a very good environment to be in when you're trying to plan a multi-decade program like Artemis. And that was only 2019. However, with the momentum at the end of that year, the Japanese government decided that we will join the Artemis program. 2020 springtime came COVID. When I went back to Japan for half a year, and we worked from Japan to discuss all of this still, all the international agreements that we had to do to build the Artemis International Partnership. 2020 June, we agreed on, we had a statement that was called the Joint Exploration Declaration of Intent, which abbreviates as JEDI. That was, that for the first time said that Japan has the intention to land our astronaut on the moon. Then we had in 2020 October the Artemis Accord. So over that summer we negotiated this. First time it came, it was a bit of a surprise, but there was a huge momentum And immediately after seeing the text, we understood what it meant, and also the importance for partnership and alliance, and also inclusion, transparency, all of that. So I think all along the Japanese government was very, very supportive in negotiating this. End of 2020, we also signed the Gateway MOU, and then the next year, 2021, at the end, the Prime Minister also announced that Japan would like to land an Japanese astronaut on the moon by late 2020s. So being announced at the highest level was a huge, also very proactive, which is unlike un-Japanese in my view. And I think it's great that we're doing this. 2022, last year, at the end, we also signed the implementing arrangement that promised for a astronaut flight on the Gateway, and also with the extension of the ISS. And so we're steadily moving forward on this. This year, at the beginning, January, at NASA headquarters, the Prime Minister came to witness the signing of the framework agreement on US-Japan space cooperation. And this will greatly facilitate the US-Japanese space programs, because we can now sign in a much more facilitated process under this framework agreement arrangements for individual programs. The first one of which, who knows, might be for the Artemis program. So we're now working on that as well. So this whole, evolution is amazing in my view, just considering that the last time we were here, 2019, how different things are today. So I think it's a great accomplishment.
My hair was a lot less gray in 2019. I think I lost a little bit of just thinking about the tweets and the Gateway using or not. And again, as Masami says, we view so much of this as inevitable, yet it was Herculean efforts by some people on this stage, by a lot of people throughout the world to pull this together.
I didn't get to the Mars part, so I guess we can still talk about this in subsequent questions.
Tell us about
but
Mars.
So the Mars is very different environment from lunar, and we're just trying to figure out what to do on lunar, this. However, with Mars, I think there will be a same need for governance, where we can probably build on what we're doing right now for the moon and adapt that to Mars in maybe 10 years or so. So I hope I'll still be in ACT then and to work on that too.
Thank you, Masami. Nello, if we could turn to you. And Gabriel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do want to comment that Italy was one of, if not the first, to actually commit to moving forward with the Accords. So we greatly appreciate the leaning forward that Italy did for the Artemis Accords and norms of behavior in general. So from your perspective, and particularly as a pilot, as you look at space exploration and the dangers that come from that, what's your view of the Accords and Italy's participation, and even any personal thoughts on Mars and the importance of Martian exploration?
Yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for inviting me, representing Italy. Test pilot, as always I say, I don't know why I'm talking about space now, because I've done most of my life in the flying airplane. But actually, in 2017, an astronaut called me and asked me to run space in Italy first for the Air Force, and then after a couple of years, I went to run up to work for the Italian government. And was that time when we started to really push for Artemis. I was working with the Prime Minister's office, and we decided to sign and to push in this direction, in the Artemis direction, because we really believed in Artemis program. First of all, we have, like as Italy, US, a long-lasting collaboration in the space, but we really believe the principles of the Artemis programs. Why is that? We think that the Artemis could lead like the sustainable space operation for sure, but we really think that we can create a new business model, a new private partner collaboration, the new opportunity for the whole industrial system that will be supporting all the space sector in the future. Why is that? I mean, Italy is like, you know that we have built more than 60% of space station. We have this huge capability of manufacturing capabilities to build like this pressurized module. So at that time, we thought, why don't we jump on board this program to start to really contribute to the first lunar village, for its infrastructure, directly to working with the US as our first partner in space. We started to do that, and so we, soon after Japan, in September 2020, we signed a joint statement with the US, a bilateral joint statement, and soon after, October, we were the first nation in Europe to sign the Artemis Accords. After that, we started to really work on the with NASA, especially, try to find a way to start to build our first model for the lunar habitation. So the first lunar model, habitable model on the moon. And what should I say about my experience as test pilot and Mars? Well, I think that I come from a world where everything is we test before. We do things. So we test for other people. We test planes for like all other pilots. So I think that the moon system, what we are doing on the moon, could really be a test bed to do wherever we are going to do on Mars. Yes, the condition, maybe the physical condition, they are a little bit different, but the basic principles will be the same. So for sure, through the Artemis program and to the lunar activities, we are going to know much more how to live on Mars, what we can do on Mars. So that's pretty much my thought as test pilot. And the last thing I want to say that it's not only about technical things, like technical approach that we should test, but we can start to test also. You and everybody here talking about a little bit of laws. We can start to test also some a legal and economic system on Mars, because I think that will be the most challenging achievement to reach. Because actually, it's often we have seen here on the Earth a lot of regulation, a lot of rules that sometimes just they don't give too much freedom. I think that we have a huge opportunity to use lunar activities and Mars activities to think about a new approach, a new kind of freedom regulation, a kind of a planet like in which we can settle a standard regulation, a standard law that could be helpful for everybody in this world. And maybe we can just go away from all these kind of differences, like with the general consensus and with the common approach worldwide. Thank you.
Ella, would you like to go to Mars, given the opportunity?
If somebody will ask me, yes, why not? We can
At a volunteer, ready to go.
Yeah.
So Valda, before we go to Mars, as I look out in the audience, I see a lot of young and new faces, which is fantastic. And I think when people think about Martian exploration in space, you think NASA or even Space Force. Department of State isn't the first to come to mind, but Department of State plays a critical role when it comes to space development. You've been an extraordinary leader for the Accords, for space development. Could you just tell folks briefly a little bit more about what the Department of State does, the interactions with the United Nations, and how you support space exploration?
Sure. I love that question. Right, NASA, you think space, you think NASA, of course, everybody thinks NASA. The State Department is, I would say, in many ways, sort of the quiet partner. The State Department's remit is diplomatic engagement. That is our job. And so as part of that diplomatic engagement and in support of the Artemis Accords, we are uniquely positioned in some ways to engage with partners bilaterally when our Secretary of State or other senior leadership travel internationally or welcome international guests. We are uniquely positioned to ensure that, if appropriate, the Artemis Accords, the importance of the Accords, the principles of the Accords are reflected in the talking points, the briefing materials. I'm the head of delegation for COPIUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the plenary, which will take place May 31st to June 10th. That is an opportunity for the State Department to talk to international partners about the importance of the Accords, the values that we want to promote and get others to adopt. I think that there's also a recognition on the part of the State Department, and I think all of my colleagues, that this is not just a US-led endeavor. One of the working groups, aimed at advancing or talking about the value of joining the Artemis Accords, one of the two I mentioned, that is actually not led by the United States. That's led by Poland and Brazil, and that's intentionally so. The US does not want to be out front and center. We are a partner among our equal Artemis Accord signatories. And so that is another thing that we promote. We're happy to talk about it. We don't need to always be front and center. So those are some of the efforts that we make. We also talk to our commercial partners, whether it's our Department of Commerce Office of Space Commerce colleagues or the private sector. We try to encourage and include their voices. As part of COPIUS that I'm attending in a couple of weeks, we put out a request for proposal. We ask NGOs, academia, and the commercial sector to submit proposals if they would like to participate in UN COPIUS, to deliver a technical presentation or to be present. That is a way that we bring in the important voices that are outside of just the government, whether it's NASA or Commerce or the State Department. We bring in a more fulsome representation of the views, the concerns that are out there, and we ensure that they are reflected in the broader discussions that we have in international fora. So those are some of the things that we as a Department of State do.
Always appreciated State extending that hand out to the private sector, and something I think that makes the American private sector special, and we've also seen great work in Japan and Italy relative to that. Public-private partnerships, which has been largely responsible for the second golden age of space that we're experiencing. I'd like to get to audience questions quickly, but before we do that, and I would maybe begin with Gabriel, but Masami or Aniello, if you have comments on this, space resources, which has been a controversial topic in space policy, yet particularly as we look at Mars, vital. That again, if we're going to go to Mars safely and sustainably, we're going to need to live off the land to be able to utilize in situ resources. Maybe Gabriel, very briefly, if you could kick us off with what the Accords say and don't say, and any thoughts that you might have, and Masami or Aniello, relative to the importance of space resources from a policy perspective and how you would like to see this all play out. Gabriel?
Yeah, sure. And I'll take you all down a little trip down memory lane back to 2015. For those of you who were following space industry back then, you might remember there was a spate of articles that, in newspapers or magazines, people talking about the first $1 trillion is going to be made in space, and asteroid mining is going to be the new thing, and you're going to go get all this platinum from outer space and bring it back, and you're going to be rich. There was some investment, there were some startup companies, and just a ton of hype about that. And whether that worked out, you can take a wild guess. But just in terms of law and policy, what happened as a result of that was a huge amount of reaction internationally. A lot of pushback, a lot of other countries, academics, nonprofits, or whatever, or people here in the United States as well, waking up and saying, oh my gosh, are space resources about to be a thing? If so, I don't know how I feel about that. Or maybe I actually feel pretty negative about that. Or maybe that makes me think that we need to come up with additional rules or something. So all of a sudden, the whole world paid attention in 2015. This was heightened when the US Congress passed some pretty basic legislation that underscored the legality of US companies getting space resources. But still, there was all this churn internationally. So fast forward a little bit to 2020, 2019, 2020, when we were talking about the Artemis Accords, we recognized, those of us involved in that we needed to get past this churn and create a common starting point, along with our allies and closest partners, so that we could have really important conversations, because there are important conversations to be had about space resources, particularly as you look towards Mars. As Mike said, and I'm sure you all know, for lots of reasons, it's gonna be almost certainly more important for Martian exploration. So how do you get to those real conversations instead of the churn? So what we did with the Artemis Accords was include from the very first draft some really basic propositions, and it's really just three things. One, it is lawful to use space resources, or maybe you could flip that and say it's not always unlawful, so there's some way to use it lawfully. But if you do use space resources, you've got to follow the Outer Space Treaty, other legal obligations. Those are kind of two sides of the same coin. And then the third thing it says is we need to go to the United Nations and talk more about this, and we should all do this together. So that is it. You know, people treat the Artemis Accords as if it's some kind of revolutionary statement when it comes to space resources. But I think when you unpack it, those three statements are pretty uncontroversial. And since 2020, since the Artemis Accords came out, they have in fact, I think, formed the basis of much more substantive, continued international as well as domestic conversations about how you should do space resources, what that would look like. Instead of, can we do this at all? Oh my gosh, how do we feel about it? We've moved past that knee-jerk reaction into something much more interesting. The last thing I'll say as we move into this operational world is now that we've gotten a little bit past that initial hesitation, now it's time for operators like NASA, where I work, or other places, to look at how this will fit into actual mission architectures. You know, the office I work in right now, an Office of Technology, Policy, and Strategy, we look at things like, you know, when does it make sense to use space resources versus when does it make sense to bring things with you? How does that differ based on the launch vehicles you have available? How does it differ based on where you're going? Obviously, Mars is different than the Moon. It's much farther and harder to get things there. So now we're able to have those really interesting conversations, and the conversations that Valda and her team lead at the United Nations about what are the international rules about this, instead of the much more emotional knee-jerk reactions we were having in 2015 or so. And I think that's largely because of the Artemis Accords.
Yeah, and a vital point, the Accords are a beginning of a conversation, not an ending. Masami, thoughts on space resources?
Yeah, I wanted to congratulate the challenge done by iSpace, that they tried to go to the moon surface, to be the first commercial company to do that, and I hope they will keep trying. And of course, that was the contract that you guys came up with, the innovative contract to have them scoop up a little bit of regolith for NASA and to transfer that to NASA as a contract, not physically, but in the contract. So that was an innovative contractual experiment, I will call it, and I hope we can try that again. So as we go on to Mars, it will have atmosphere, wind, more gravity will make it even more challenging to land and do things. And so for discussions like safety zones and all of that will be more different. But yeah, that will also be a challenge to tackle.
I think we were so proud at NASA that of those contracts for regolith, 2 of them were international, that we were able to go global with those, including iSpace, which was a terrific effort, and I certainly hope that no one's enthusiasm was dimmed by that. Space is hard, and we look forward to the next attempt. Nello, thoughts on space resources, being able to mine Mars or utilize resources for exploration?
Yes, first of all, I completely agree with Gabriel. Actually, we started, as I said before, all the process because we had the same vision as Italy. But I would like to add something like from a personal point of view, like this pilot, I would say, as before I said, you know, we need to, that's really important to start to work on now on space resources and how to, you know, to try to manage all the difficulties at the international level, but we need to go there first. I mean, my idea is like, it's important to talk now, but just push to start to go first on the moon and start to act to do things. Because from my experience, I've seen that when you start really to manage the problems in real life, real day, real time, then you start really to think about it. Because everything we can see now, maybe you can talk about, that's very important, the general consensus right now, to start to go there, but I'm waiting the day we start to really to be on the moon first, then on Mars, and to start to use these resources. And from that day, will be the day when we'll have the possibility really to understand how we can manage at international level, international policy with a common idea on how to get the resources. But just in conclusion, I would say that it's really, there are a lot of talking about the resources, but sorry to be so direct, but let's say the truth. I mean, that's the main reason we are going there sometimes. I mean, a lot of people, why all the companies, all the private companies are pushing there because that's the main reason we are going there. I mean, that's reality. So, and it's good that as a government we start to put some rules, but I'm waiting for the day we go there, we start to use the resources.
Such a vital point that if we're not first, we run the risk of this entire dialogue being moot because China could end up pushing the rules. And I think it's so important that we not only take shots, our technology, but our values in the free world to the moon and to Mars. So that's a great point. And we have a stark contrast now. And I hope that our various governments all continue to support in a robust fashion the Artemis program so that we can make sure that norms of behavior are adopted that lead to a peaceful and prosperous future. So in the time we have left, let's turn to our audience. I see we already have someone about to ask a question. If you could tell us your name and then your question.
Sure. Doug White from Stellar Solutions, contracted engineer for NASA. I think this is probably directed at Gabriel. You touched on it earlier about the Outer Space Treaty, and the Artemis Accords is really a fleshing out of the Artemis Treaty, or the Outer Space Treaty. Could you go into a little bit more detail as one of the non-readers of the Artemis Accords? I promise I'll do it later. Could you kind of highlight the differences between the two? And then for the international partners, what was your country's motivation to sign on to the Artemis Accords?
Sure, I can give sort of a real quick primer in terms of how the way we think about it. There's sort of, you could think about the Artemis Accords as fitting into maybe two different types of provisions. And you definitely should read it. It's only like 8 pages long, so it's quite a quick read. A number of the provisions are very clearly derived from the Outer Space Treaty. And the examples I'll give there are like the deconfliction provision that talks about the creation of safety zones. Now, safety zones themselves aren't in the Outer Space Treaty. But what's in the Outer Space Treaty is this obligation called due regard. And it's in Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. It says you have to give due regard to the corresponding interest of other countries in outer space. It also says you should coordinate before you interfere with their operations. So we took those two ideas and said, okay, well, how would we actually do that in the real world? And we came up with this idea of safety zones, which is maybe not the best term because what it actually means, as Mike said, is notice and deconfliction, right? And you talk and you coordinate and then you deconflict each other's activities. So you avoid interference, that's how you give due regard. So that's a great example of taking the Outer Space Treaty and then figuring out how you would do the thing. The same with rescue and return. The rescue provisions or emergency assistance provisions, the Artemis Accords, go a tiny bit step further in terms of how much you're committing to provide emergency assistance. The same with registration. That's another example of where the Artemis Accord signatories are committing a little bit more beyond what the Outer Space Treaty or the Registration Convention provide. Then there's a couple provisions that really don't reference something directly from the Outer Space Treaty. Examples there would be the protection of human heritage. The Outer Space Treaty just doesn't talk about it. But we think it's important. The United States Congress thinks it's important. So we NASA have certain obligations to protect human heritage. And all the partners seem to think it's important. So it's not a...
As a quick follow-on to that, is it envisioned then to replace the Outer Space Treaty, or is it just in addition to, because you alluded to before that rule number 2 was follow the Outer Space Treaty. So,
Sure.
Before the international
So
partners.
you got to think, step back and think about what the Artemis Accords are. They're us promising to restrain ourselves, right? We're not going out there in the world and telling everyone how they have to behave. We're telling the world how we will behave. So when you think about it that way, I think this idea of replacing the Outer Space Treaty, that kind of falls away, right? The Outer Space Treaty sets some baseline rules, but you absolutely can say, and also I will refrain from additional things. That's what we would consider like good behavior, right? That's being a responsible space citizen, or however you want to think about it. So that's how you should think about provisions like heritage. It's not in the Outer Space Treaty to protect human heritage, but we, Artemis Accord signatories, are saying, and also we will protect human heritage in space. We hope that catches on, but for now it's us promising to refrain ourselves from doing anything. I know we're about out of time, so I'll stop there. But that's the way I think about it. There's the implementing the Outer Space Treaty, and then there's the additional obligations we've imposed on ourselves because we think that's what responsible behavior looks like.
Just note the full, free, and open release of scientific data is another addition.
There's another
It isn't
one.
necessarily
Yeah.
required, but it's us being what good looks like. Comments, Masami, Aniello?
Yes, so the motivation for Japan to join, I believe, was, of course, to strengthen the partnership in the Artemis program, also to reiterate that we do follow the principles in the Outer Space Treaty, and also because the Outer Space Treaty is quite general in some ways. The Artemis Accords gives more specificity while still being a political declaration at this moment. So in the future, we can take in those elements from these political statements that we have made, and one day when we are all very sure, we can go into codifying it.
Ella?
Yeah, as I said before, basically we really believe in this sustainable space operation, and we really believe that with the Artemis we can start this commercial partnership collaboration, and we can for sure sustain our companies, and then basically I agree with what Masami said. It's like it's all about consensus, it's all about starting new rules. So that's why we decided as you know.
Thank you. So in the interest of no space program ever running on time, we're going to go to one last question. We may go a few minutes over, but sir, you've been very patient. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Bruce Jakosky, University of Colorado. Question for Gabriel. I am one of the 5 or 6 people in the world who's read the Artemis Accords, and I have a question about...
Surely more than 5 to 6.
I have a question about access to resources. The thing that jumped out at me when I read it was the concept of sustainable use of resources, and I'm wondering what you think sustainable means and how you think it would be evaluated or regulated.
Those are great questions, and I think recognizing that those are the kinds of questions we need to answer is the first step. I don't have answers for those things, right? And I think that's a good example of the kind of question that we didn't try to answer, and now, in my personal opinion, it would have been inappropriate for not only the United States, but also our group of partners to try to answer for the world. Partly because those are questions that the entire space community is going to have to struggle with, but also because we just don't know the facts exactly that we're talking about now. Right? NASA is about to engage in a campaign of resource prospecting, along with many of our partners who are also doing resource prospecting. So we don't really even know how plentiful these resources are. Where are they? We think we have some pretty good suspicions, but we don't really know. And we still don't even 100% know how they're going to fit in our architectures. So I don't know is the short answer. The answers to those questions are probably going to vary based on resource, right? There's some kinds of resources that are essentially unlimited except in location, right? So you can think of the alleged peaks of eternal light, which are not eternal on the moon, but these peaks of highlighting areas. You can get all the energy you want if you can get on the peak. So what's actually limited there is the location, right? The geography. That's probably different than something like water ice, but then you go to Mars, all of a sudden you're talking about resources that may well be distributed globally in a very different way than in the moon. So all of a sudden you have a different set of constraints. So I think it's going to depend on resource, and it's going to depend on much broader conversations. And that's where I don't know where the answers are going to go. We turn into sort of Valda's world here. But it's really hopeful that we are talking about these things now, because humanity does not have an awesome history of answering these kinds of questions terrestrially. So the fact that we are talking about them now, before the tech is even there, 100%, we're still at technology testbed phase in terms of space. I think that's very hopeful. Doesn't mean we'll get it right, but it means we are asking the right questions at the right time.
And we will end on that note of modesty, and that you all have the opportunity to continue to help us on this journey of exploration of not just space, but policy. So with that, let's have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists.